Connaissance, recherche, sciences,
dessin, mathématiques,
théorie,
physique,
philosophie,
conférences,
archéologie, environnement, nature.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here with you today. I am sorry that I will not be able to speak in French to you, but I think you prefer English over my native language, German, so this is a compromise, a linguistic compromise, and English actually is increasingly becoming the international language of science. As Henri Leridon has already mentioned, I work for several institutions, but the most important, where I spend most of my time, is IIASA, the so-called International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is housed in a castle some 30 kilometers south of Vienna. Actually, this castle was built by Empress Maria Theresia, and Marie Antoinette, who you know very well, actually was born in these rooms and spent most of her childhood, which now is the office space, and I'm not sitting far away from those rooms. Unfortunately, after World War II, the Russians used this as a local headquarters and even as a horse stable, and much of the original furniture has disappeared since. What I want to do now in this hour is to first have a look at the global picture, the global demographic outlook for the 21st century, and will actually make reference to many of the driving forces that Henri Leridon has just explained to you. The main part then will deal with the future of low fertility in Europe and whether we see a likely increase in fertility on the horizon or could possibly even expect a further decline of birth rates. And in the end, I want to give an outlook to something that excites me quite a lot recently, which is trying to go beyond the pure numbers of people and add the quality dimension, if you want, which is adding educational levels to the distribution of the population. If we look at the world as a whole, the big picture tells us that the 20th century clearly can be called the century of population growth. Some people even say the world population explosion. The world population increased from 1.6 billion in 1900 to 6.1 billion in the year 2000. Fortunately, easy to remember numbers. The 21st century will probably be called by future historians the century of population aging. There are many indicators of aging, as we will discuss. One is the proportion of the population above the age of 60, which currently stands at about 10% of the world population being above the age of 60. Well, by 2100, this proportion will be anywhere between around 25% and 45%, depending on what will be the future of longevity. But it is important to stress that currently we live in a deeply divided world in demographic terms. Some countries, mostly in Africa and the Arab world, still grow very fast, while others are aging very rapidly. This is mostly in Europe and in East Asia, and some are actually shrinking already in Eastern Europe. So this big picture really is driven by the demographic transition that you've heard Henri Leridon talk about, that after initial mortality decline, fertility also starts to decline, but with some lag. And this paradigm explains much of the demographic trends over the 20th century and is the main basis for our forecasts for the 21st century. But the original assumption was that fertility decline will stop when replacement level is reached. But so far, the reality has been quite different. Most countries that reached replacement level in their fertility decline then went below replacement level. And today, about half of the entire world population is below replacement level. Once you consider differences in countries such as India, where southern India is essentially below replacement level. So why does fertility fall so much lower in some countries? You've heard Henri talk about this. There's one hypothesis that also Peter MacDonald has put forward and that I find rather attractive. That's what we call the partial modernization hypothesis. It is the combination of traditional family and particularly gender norms together with female economic opportunities in a modern labor market. And we'll hear about this later on. So this is the real big picture from the year 1000 onwards to the year 2100 in terms of population size. Throughout human history, the world population has been fluctuating at a very low level, not surpassing about 500 million people or 500 million. It was only then in the 19th century that world population started to grow, mostly due to a decline in death rates, due to better nutrition and better sanitation. And then, as we've discussed, the 20th century really saw this skyrocketing in population size. The colored lines you see here at the ends are the fractals of an uncertainty distribution of what we can expect up to the year 2100. So we'll talk more about this, but it shows quite a huge uncertainty range. It could either go down to less than 6 billion, less than today already by the end of this century, or further increase to more than 12 billion people, depending on the future of fertility mostly, but also mortality. How can we forecast the population? Well, first we need a starting population information about the population by age and sex for each region for which we are doing the projection. And then we need to make assumptions about the three components of change: the fertility, the birth rates, mortality, and migration, if we look at regions or countries. In a way, the population projections are easier than economic projections or others because we really only have these three factors to consider. In other models, you have dozens of factors to be considered. But of course, each of these factors is very difficult to anticipate with its future trend. And when doing population projections, we need to be aware that the future path of all three factors is uncertain. And not all population projections that you see are reflecting these uncertainties. Many statistical agencies and the United Nations Population Division give you three variants, high, medium, and low, which only make different fertility assumptions, but otherwise make the identical mortality and migration assumptions. If you want to consider uncertainty in all the three factors, you either have to do a lot of scenarios or do truly probabilistic population projections. As I will show you some, what we've done at my institute, IIASA, we have about 2,000 simulated alternative world population paths, sort of randomly picking from distributions of future fertility, mortality, and migration. And I just show this to you to show that the future is quite uncertain. You see, the only thing that's certain is over the next 20, 30 years, we will see further increase in the world population. And this is due to the so-called momentum of population growth, that the world population is very young and more women are coming into reproductive age, and therefore it's a certainty that we will see more population growth. But then you have some paths that start to decline very rapidly, others that jump up to 12 billion and start to decline. Then you have all sort of an increase, followed by a leveling off, followed by another decrease. So the real trend are going to be not as smooth as the typical projections show you. And here we tried to simulate some of these possible future paths. If you put them all together and sort them, sort of all these 2,000 simulations, you get a distribution. Currently, we're about at 6.7 billion. The red line gives you the median, where half of the simulated cases are above and the other half is below. And this brown area gives you the 95% interval, prediction interval. So you see that in our projections, probably between 2060 and 2070, there may be a peak in the median case, slightly below 9 billion people, but we may as well end up much higher or much lower. So this is the best description as we believe we can make about what we know and what we don't know about the future of world population growth. And this is very different for different parts of the world. Here you see sub-Saharan Africa, where very significant further increase, more than a doubling or even tripling of the population is highly likely, because fertility rates are still very high, and also the population is extremely young still. So most likely sub-Saharan Africa will increase from some 600-700 million up to about 2 billion, but it could possibly be much more if fertility does not decline as anticipated, if the demographic transition does not proceed as assumed at the moment. And the other extreme is Eastern Europe. With almost certainty we will see continued population decline in Eastern Europe. And here the question only is how fast it will decline. We'll talk about this later on, but Eastern Europe happens to have this combination in all three factors of a downward trend. Fertility is very low. There's out-migration, so more people are leaving the countries than they are entering. And also life expectancy is not as high, so rather high mortality. So all these three factors work into the direction of further population decline. So Eastern Europe might well halve in size of population by the end of this century. And then there are other regions where the China region is an interesting case, where we know that for the coming 2 decades we'll likely see further increase, but then some decrease. How do we know? Well, as you know, China has recently gone through a very rapid fertility decline. But since this fertility decline is so recent, there still are very big cohorts of women in reproductive age and actually more entering. And so because of this momentum of population growth, we'll see the increase. But then the fertility, which is estimated to be about 1.5 at the moment, will lead to substantial population decline. Well, there are many other indicators. One that is frequently mentioned is called the support ratio. This is the number of people in presumed working age, 15 to 64, divided by the, in this way it's not the dependency ratio, but the support ratio, meaning how many people in working age are there per pensioner. And this is really the graph that makes many European leaders so nervous, because we see with very high certainty that this is to decline by about half. So at the moment, at the level of the European Union, we have about 4 people of working age per people of pension age, and this will decline by the middle of the century already. So this is just 50 years here, to somewhere around 2. And the uncertainty range is rather small because many of these people are already born. We know how their cohort size is, and it's only the future immigration and the future fertility that has a marginal impact on this. We've talked about the uncertainty about the future life expectancy. And this is a quite extreme case. We are looking now at the population in Western Europe that is above the age of 80. At the moment, there's about 3% of the Western European population above the age of 80. And over the coming decades, this is expected to increase, but relatively modestly, maybe by 2030 reaching some 6%. A doubling is still a doubling, but it's nothing as compared to what we can expect during the second half of the century. And here it really depends whether the so-called optimists or the so-called pessimists with respect to the future of human life expectancy are right. So if we are actually close to a ceiling in life expectancy, as some people like Olshansky was mentioned and others think that life expectancy will not increase much in the future, then the proportion will still be higher than today, but it will be somewhere in this lower range. If others who are the so-called optimists are right, and we will see a continuation of the past improvements or even an acceleration in life expectancy, then we will be somewhere up here, which means that by the year 2100, the proportion of the population above the age of 80 will be 1/3 or even above 40% of the entire population. Some people often wonder whether we should call this an optimistic scenario. Of course, this can only happen if those future elderly are also in a much better health status. And in that sense, I think that it will be a manageable society. The only thing we have to change is the mean age at retirement. We cannot have a population with 40% above the age of 80 and still have 57 or 58 as the mean age of retirement. You also see two small horizontal lines here. This is what the long-range projections of the United Nations give you in their low and their high scenario. First of all, it shows that they are assuming a somewhat lower increase in life expectancy in this range. We assume here at the bottom a 0 increase in life expectancy, and at the top a 4-year increase per decade, with the median, the white line, giving you the 2-year increase per decade, which is an experience that we had over the last decades in Europe. But the reason also why the interval is so much narrower for the United Nations is due to the fact that I mentioned before, that they do not make alternative mortality assumptions. This interval is only due to alternative fertility assumptions, which of course also affects the proportion. Okay, let's go on now. Population pyramids. This is Austria, and like every European country, you can use the population pyramid to read the entire history over the past century. So this is the World War I. Here you see what we in the German-speaking countries call the Nazi baby boom during the 1940s, very strong pronatalist policies. Then the end of World War II, and then this big baby boom that we've heard so much about, the high birth rates during the 1960s, followed by a decline during the 70s. Here we can also produce a probabilistic population pyramid where we try to depict the uncertainty intervals. Again, this range is the 95% uncertainty range. And you see the uncertainty for the year 2030 is the highest as regarding to the future number of children. So how many school places we need is the least certain for planners because the fertility is uncertainty. We have much more certainty how many people will retire because these people are already alive, and we know fairly well how many of them will retire in the age of 2030 at a given age. This uncertainty here in young adulthood is mostly due to migration. These people are already born, but we don't know how many of these at these ages will enter the country. And then up here, you also see increasing uncertainty again, particularly for women, which reflects the uncertainty about future life expectancy that we just discussed. This is for the EU15, less extreme than in Austria, because there are some higher fertility countries such as France, and some others with still lower. So at the all European level, everything looks a bit smoother than for individual countries. Well, I don't really want to go into the many indicators of population aging. We've just recently published some new indicators that are really quite revolutionary in the way that they do not use the conventional definition of age, where age is defined as the time since birth. But we alternatively define age as the remaining life expectancy, the expected time to death, because many determinants of our behavior really depend on how much time we expect to still be alive. You all know the saying that 40 is the new 30, sort of that 40-year-old people today feel like 30-year-old people felt some decades apart. And this is really taking account of this, and there are indicators such as the proportion of the population that has a remaining life expectancy of 14 years or less as compared to for instance, the proportion that has 60 years since birth. So many of these traditional aging indicators can also be formulated with respect to the remaining life expectancy. And here you see for many world regions as a part of our new projections, for instance, this new indicator, the percentages of the population with remaining life expectancies below 15 years. And you see the top is Japan, because they are the oldest population in the world. But soon Eastern Europe is taking over, And why Eastern Europe? It's interesting because they combine old population structure with a relatively low life expectancy. So there's a higher proportion of the people in Eastern Europe will be bound to die within the coming 15 years. So Eastern Europe really will be the population that is closest to death, if you want, in many respects. North America is somewhere in between, and of course the youngest continent is sub-Saharan Africa, where the proportion is relatively low, but also is likely to increase during the second half of the century. Well, we don't really have time to go into this. I just wanted to mention that last year we managed to publish a demographic paper in the journal Nature, which is the world's leading scientific journal. It's very hard for a social scientist to get in because it's typically only physical and biological science that publish there. But in that sense, demography is also considered in a way a biological science. We had to correspond with the biology editor because they don't have a social science editor. And the title is really indicative of what we are expecting. It's the coming acceleration of global population aging. And that's what this graph here shows. This is sort of the speed of aging in different parts of the world is likely to pick up, and somewhere between 2015 and 2025, we will see the most rapid speed of aging on a global level. Okay, now let's go over to fertility. I've talked enough about the global picture. What about fertility in Europe? Europe was the first continent to fall below replacement level, and as it was said, we had this baby boom followed by a steep decline in the 1970s. And here just this period fertility indicator, this indicateur conjoncturel, is showing for many countries, similar to what has been shown for France to you. We had this decline from a rather high level in the 1960s to a level somewhere between 1.5 and 2 during the 1970s and 80s. And then at the end, most recently, we really saw a bifurcation. Some countries are going below 1.5, where others have slightly recovered and are in the range 1.5 to 2. So this is Western Europe. Southern Europe had a decline somewhat later, but even steeper. So most of the Southern European countries are now in the range below 1.5. Northern Europe had a decline early on, but never declined to such a low level. You see Ireland is sort of a latecomer to this development. But Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and also Norway, they never declined to such low levels as Central or Southern Europe did. And most interesting is the case of the Central Eastern European countries that under the socialist regime managed to maintain relatively high fertility, around 2. You see some variation here, but this was in the 1980s clearly higher than the fertility in Western Europe. But then, after the transformation in 1990, you see this precipitous decline in the total fertility rates, the period indicators of fertility, which is quite remarkable and almost parallel in all of the Central Eastern European countries. As we see from this graph, which plots the mean age of childbearing, however, this decline in the period indicator of fertility was associated with a very rapid increase in the mean age of childbearing. So to say, many births were postponed to following years, and that resulted both in the decline of the period indicator as well as in the increase in the mean age of childbearing. Now, this requires us now to enter a somewhat more technical topic, which is the tempo effect. And it's just a different way of putting what you've seen by Henri Leridon before, the difference between the descendance finale, or if you measure it try to approximate this by indicators from 1 year, what we call the quantum of fertility, the number of children that women have, with the period indicator of fertility, which is being distorted by several factors, but in particular also by changes in the mean age of childbearing. So what you see here is a hypothetical case. Let's say women are having on average 1.8 children. That is what we have in the European Union, roughly at the moment. Well, yeah, if at the level of cohort fertility, And then, let's assume in a certain year, here it is the year 4 to 5 of a hypothetical scale, 20% of the women have their child 1 year later. They postpone it to the coming year. And then all of a sudden this period indicator will decline by 20%. And the mean age of childbearing here will increase from, let's say, 26 to 26.2. It's only a very minor increase. If 10% postpone, it's the 10th of a year. If 20%, it's 0.2 of a year. And unless they keep postponing later on, then it will be a flat line. And only if the mean age of childbearing would come down again, and this is what happened during the baby boom, you would have this recovery. Otherwise, you have this depressed fertility in 1 calendar year. There are different ways of showing this, but this is one that several people found appealing. So delaying the childbearing is a major reason for the currently low period fertility across Europe. And as long as the mean age of childbearing increases, fertility will be depressed. Policies could possibly try to stop this increase, and this is something we're going to discuss at the end. But it would only affect the timing of children and not necessarily the number of children over the lifetime. In Europe, generally the overall fertility rate would jump from 1.5 to 1.8 if the increase stopped immediately. And this is an article we published in the journal Science in 2003, where we give several simulations for Europe. The black line shows you what would happen to the Western European population if there were instant jump to replacement fertility. We actually see that the population would still decline somewhat, which means that Europe has already entered what demographers call a negative momentum of population growth. You know, we've talked for Africa, the positive momentum, so many young women entering the reproductive age. In Europe, we have the situation that fewer women are entering reproductive age, and therefore the population would decline even if fertility jumped to replacement level. And then we present different calculations how a tempo effect of 20 years followed by an increase to replacement level would affect the overall population size, and we see very, very significant implications of the tempo effect, even if it's only for 10 or 20 years, on the overall population size in Europe. Now let's come to another issue that has raised much attention. That I recently went 1.5 years ago to Spain. There was a meeting in Barcelona, and this was before the elections in Spain, and we had a reception there in the governor's office, a wonderful luncheon, which, like in Barcelona, often it took 3 hours, and several high politicians gave a speech. And since they heard that we were demographers, they all started to praise how successful they have been in increasing the level of fertility. They saw that the TFR has been going up, and I will soon show you the graphs, and they've all interpreted it as being a result of their brave efforts that have saved the population of Spain from sliding into demographic disasters. Demographers are usually more cautious in interpreting the recent trends in this way, because we know that this increase in the period indicators could also be predominantly just a weakening of the depressing tempo effect. Now let's look at this. It's Spain. So the black line for Spain, we have the years 1980 to 2006. The black line is the total fertility rate, which indeed decreased very sharply. We've seen this to a level of well below 1.2. It was almost 1.1 in the late 90s. And since then has picked up quite visibly. What we see here in red is the mean age at first birth, which has also increased very sharply, but recently has leveled off. There is no more further increase. Sort of Spain has reached about the highest level that you can reach in the mean age of childbearing. And the blue lines here are two efforts of calculating what we call tempo-adjusted fertility indicators, where we try to take out this distorting tempo effect. And you see the difference between the period indicator, the black line, and the adjusted one, the blue line, just depends on the speed of increase. When there is very rapid increase during those years, there's a big difference. And when there's little increase or no increase, the difference disappears. So what this graph shows us that indeed, as suspected, most of this increase in recent period fertility in Spain is the consequence of an end of the tempo effect. And we see here an almost flat line of this tempo-adjusted TFR. Actually, a colleague, Tomáš Sobotka, has calculated that if we took out the additional births that were born to immigrants in Spain, then we might have even seen a further decline in the tempo-adjusted fertility in the estimate of the quantum, the level, overall level of fertility. This even comes out much more strongly if we only look at the first birth. You see the first birth probability in Spain went down to a mere 57% of all women having a first birth, which is clearly not true on the cohort level, and it just has been this very strong tempo distortion, and then recovered recently to more than 75. If we look at these adjusted rates, they give a much more reasonable estimate of some continued decline in the proportion of women that have a first child, and not much of a recovery at all at the end. Well, we've done this for many countries. Actually, my colleague Tomáš Sobotka at our Vienna Institute, and it looks quite different. For instance, this is the Czech Republic. Here we also have seen a remarkable recovery, which happens under conditions of continued increase in the mean age of birth, which means there still is a difference between the period and the tempo-adjusted fertility measure, and we may even see a slight increase here in the quantum. So in the Czech Republic, it may be there may be an element of a real fertility increase in this. Similarly, in Sweden, we also the black line again, an increase since the late 90s, and under conditions of an increasing mean age of childbearing. And here again, the tempo-adjusted indicators show a mild increase. Let's just go to a summary table here. So for these three countries that we looked at, we tried to see how does the change, the increase in the TFR and the indicator conjuncturel that people are so pointing at. Almost everybody only looks at this total fertility rate and points at this increase. And then we also look at the adjusted TFR. So in Spain, between 1996 and 2004, the TFR actually increased by 0.17, and in terms of a percentage change, this was almost a 15% increase in the level of period fertility. However, if we look at the adjusted TFR, we saw a 7 to 8% decline in the quantum of fertility. Since with the 96 to the end of 99, we've still seen some decline. At the first birth, the difference is also huge. The TFR for first birth has increased by 28%, whereas if we look at adjusted measures, it's only 3%. For the Czech Republic and Sweden, the difference is smaller, but in all cases, the increase in fertility as estimated by these tempo-adjusted measures is much weaker than if we only look at the TFR. Okay, let's go on to another question, which is, what will be the future of fertility? Here you see for three countries that we've discussed cohort fertility. The solid lines show you what we have empirically measured, and the dotted and broken lines give you the assumptions in the UN projections and the Eurostat projections. What I wanted to show is that on the basis of the cohort trends, we really see a downward trend. That is this indicated by this arrow downward. But for some reason, most forecasting agencies assume that this downward trend in cohort fertility will not continue, that will recover somehow. The UN assumes that all countries will at the end go to 1.85, whereas Eurostat has a more moderate. They assume, depending on the country, that the future fertility will be approximately at the level of the current tempo-adjusted fertility level. Now let's really step back a little, and this is sort of the biggest last part of my speech here, thinking about the future of fertility. Evolution has produced the sex drive as the main mechanism to assure reproduction of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. There's no doubt about this being the main evolutionary mechanism. But modern contraception, as we've heard, has broken this evolutionary link. Now we can have sex without having children. As a consequence, reproduction is now predominantly a matter of social norms and individual decision-making. Not entirely, we've heard about unwanted birth, and there are other factors where but predominantly it is a matter of social norms and individual decisions. And as we've heard from Henri, biological factors are still important, and particularly when it comes to lower fertility than desired. Problems with sperm quality and quantity, also the declining female fecundability with age. If a woman tries to have a child at an advanced age, it gets more difficult for biological reasons. And then what about the desire to reproduce? We've recently conducted at Oxford University, we are working on a big project on the future of human reproduction, which is an interdisciplinary program, really tries to consider all the dimensions. We did a big review of the literature. And one of the factors that comes out as being something that still makes people have children is, in a way, to continue to live in the coming generation. But again, here, we have to start thinking about what we mean by replacement level. Typically, we say it is 2 surviving children. But this is just the population replacement level. If we ask in interviews people how many children it takes to replace themselves, of course, one person needs 1 child to replace themselves. And in order to have this child, you need a partner. But again, it is your child. So in a way, at the individual level, the individual replacement would be 1 surviving child. And this corresponds quite well to what surveys ask about the reasons for having a first child and having a second child. In most countries, parents say that the first child they want for themselves because they want to have a child. But the second child they want for the first child in order to have a sibling. And so they don't want the second child as much for themselves as for the first child. And this, of course, is based on the assumption, which is very widely spread, that it is good for a child to have a sibling, that it's to his or her benefit. And there's a complex literature about this, where actually for many important indicators, it shows that single children do better than children who have siblings. But we can't go into this discussion. I just wanted to point at this issue that even if we talk about replacement, it's not necessarily 2 surviving children. If we look at individual level, it could just be 1 surviving children. And in this context, I've recently worked with some colleagues on something that I've called the low fertility trap hypothesis. And what are we doing is, because it is through the development of consistent and testable hypotheses that science progresses. And to develop such an hypothesis does not necessarily imply that we believe it is true. We just want to formulate something, put it on the table, and start testing it. This is the only way to have science progress. Why is it called a trap? Well, there are 3 conditions that justify the use of the notion. One is it is an undesired condition, that populations or governments rather want to have a higher fertility than they currently have, which is the case in many European countries. The second condition of a trap is that it was entered unintentionally. It just happened as a byproduct of other trends. And the third is that makes a trap, once you entered it, it is very difficult or impossible to get out again. So what we are looking here is sort of a non-linear relationship, that there are some tipping points after which it is much more difficult to reverse the regime, to change conditions again. So the basic idea here is that once fertility falls below a certain level and stays there for a while, this can imply a self-reinforcing demographic regime change, that the young generation wants fewer children because they see fewer children around them, and that would be difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. And we see three different elements of this low fertility trap hypothesis. One is a demographic one, the other has to do with norms, and is of an ideational kind, and the third is of an economic nature. I tried to depict this here in one graph. So on the left-hand side, you see the decision-making process, or different indicators, if you want, of fertility of birth. At the bottom, you have the absolute number of births, or the crude birth rate, which is influenced both by the age structure and the period indicators of fertility. And behind that lies the cohort level, which is also then together with the timing of fertility influences the period fertility. But what drives the cohort fertility level? Well, it is reasonable to assume that in one way or the other, it is some ideas that we have in our heads, some intentions that we have that in the end result in a certain cohort fertility. So it's the personal ideals about family size. So the first element of the low fertility trap hypothesis is purely this already discussed momentum of change. If you have fewer births, the population age structure will get older. You will have later then fewer potential mothers, which at a given period fertility rate will still result in fewer births. So this is a purely demographic, mechanistic way. That, however, under low fertility conditions will lead to fewer and fewer births because there are fewer and fewer potential parents. Now the second is this big circle. It goes down from the number of births to the number of people with young children that are in society. And here the assumption that if there are fewer families with children out there, a new generation is being socialized in such a way that they don't see having children or having a larger number of children necessarily as a very important part of what they consider a successful life. Many of their idols, or I don't know, movie stars, television reporters, or other people that they know and value have no children or have very few children. So therefore, having children is not as important for them anymore. And then lower ideal family size will in the end lead to lower fertility and fewer births. And we'll talk about this later. And then the third is an economic one, namely that the aging population will lead to lower expected income. And this goes back to an economic hypothesis by Richard Easterlin that I will soon discuss, that if there's a gap, if people have high aspirations in terms of consumptions, you are used to being a big spender and you're buying expensive things, but your expected income is low, well, that will result in lower fertility according to Easterlin. And the Easterlin fertility has typically two parts, as it was presented by Richard Easterlin, and I had the good fortune of being his student at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was teaching economic demography. And so he said first that fertility is the result of the relationship between personal aspirations and expected income. And he could well explain the baby boom by people having rather low aspirations. They grew up in relatively poor conditions, but during the time of the baby boom, it was an economic boom time. They had high expected income, and that led to so many children. He has a second part that we will not consider here, namely says that smaller cohort size will lead to better labor market situations and therefore to higher expected income. That would sort of generate some cycles, but these don't seem to materialize, and we only look at the first part of the hypothesis. And here we'll plot for some European countries the ratio, and this comes from the Luxembourg income study, the ratio of father's income to the income of their children. So what we have here for the 1980s and the 1990s, we have the income of younger men, and Easterlin also only does this for men, and it's because the female labor force participation rates changed over time. It's easier to only focus on men here. So what is the income of young men relative to the income of their fathers 10 years earlier, when they supposedly were socialized and at the age of 15 to 25 experienced their father's income and formed their consumption preferences. So what we see really is only in the UK is the income of the sons higher than the income of the fathers. In the other European countries, actually, the next generation has lower real income in real terms than their fathers. This in itself is already implying that, according to Easterlin, this would mean fewer births. And if we look at the trend over time, this is actually getting worse. From the 1980s to the 1990s, relative income was declining. So if we base our projections of fertility on the first part of the Easterlin hypothesis, this would indeed imply lower fertility in the future, as we've showed here in this mechanism. Okay, let's just look at some empirical data here about the ideal family size. It's hard to find data that are comparable across many countries. And the Eurobarometer, which is only an opinion survey, so it's relatively small samples. It's about 1,000 persons of all age groups per country. And they've posed the same question in 2001 and in 2006 to all the EU member countries about not only the societal ideal, how many children should you have in a society, and that's the children you partly want others to have in order to pay for your pensions. But after that, they also asked about the personal ideal. How many children do you want, you consider ideal for yourself? And so the low fertility trap would predict that in countries in Europe that have relatively high fertility, also the ideal family size would be relatively stable at a high level. And that's exactly what we see here for France, for Sweden, and the United Kingdom. They were both there at a high level, both for men and women, and they are stable over time. And then they show for the German-speaking countries, first of all, because they were the first one who in the 1970s had very low fertility, with the other countries coming somewhat later. They see not only that the ideal family size is very low and continues to decline, more so for men than for women, but it would also predict that the countries that had the fertility decline somewhat later, like Italy and Spain, would just start to see a decline in ideal family size. And that's indeed what we may interpret as being seen. It's a mild decline, but it's already lower, and it is declining over time. Well, it's too early to say anything about the implication. It requires further testing, but at least it is a prima facie plausible and testable hypothesis. Actually, it has also a predictive value. You've seen the Eastern European countries having the fertility decline only in the 1990s. So if this low fertility trap hypothesis would be true, we would see the ideal family size start declining around 2010 to 2015, and we can observe whether this would actually be the case. This just zooms in again to the women, which tend to have more stable answers to this than men. This has some policy relevance because if the low fertility trap hypothesis is not true, and fertility would relatively quickly respond to incentives, then there's no reason to panic. Europe is not yet entering disaster, and governments should probably take a wait-and-see attitude, because in many European countries it is considered to be quite sensitive to interfere into the reproductive decision-making. But if the low fertility trap hypothesis should be true, and there would be a downward spiral of lower fertility causing lower desired family size, resulting again in lower fertility and lower desired family size, then there may be some tipping points after which it is very, very difficult to reverse the fertility trend, and fertility might well fall below 1, or even, I don't know whether there's a lower limit. 0 certainly is the lowest limit, and Simply, we don't know. That's the conclusion of all of this. There are good arguments that would suggest that fertility would stabilize in Europe, and there are other arguments, such as this one that I tried to explain now, that fertility could well decline further, and what the future will carry remains open. And what I want to conclude with now is several elements of what I think is a rather urgent future research agenda that needs to combine the different dimensions that jointly influence fertility. First, we have the biomedical side and the female dimension. We've talked about declining fecundability, and as the desired age of childbearing increases, so women in their late 30s or early 40s deciding to want children, well, for biological reasons, it is not so easy. Also on the male side, there are some biomedical issues that require more attention that have to do with endocrine disruptors and the effect that they have on sperm quality and quantity. Then there is contraceptive technology. We've heard a lot about this from Henri Leridon. It could well happen, and it's likely to happen, that in the future we'll have more efficient and easier methods to avoid more unplanned birth. If we sort of reverse the situation that a woman has to go to the doctor if she wants a contraceptive to be turned off, so she has to take an active step in order to become pregnant, well, in that case, we wouldn't have any unplanned birth, and that would, of course, lead to a somewhat lower birth rate. But on the other hand, as Henri has mentioned, there is significant progress in reproductive technology, and that may partly offset this. We don't know what will be the quantitative contribution to the birth rate of this in the future. And then it's really necessary to also study the genetic predispositions. Is there anything in our human nature, in our human condition, that makes us have children rather than just wanting to have sex? And as we heard, the biological link between sex and procreation has been broken. And then we really need to focus on the changing cultural norms about mating and about wanting children. This really brings in the anthropological perspective, and I've just really touched upon this issue, and much more study is necessary in this field. There also is an important sociological perspective. Social networks tend to influence what we think we want and what we actually want. And so the social interactions are influencing desired family size, and much more analysis and study is needed there. There's quite some empirical literature now showing that if in a peer group of young people, it's the hardest is for the first couple to start having children, but once an element of you have started, then the others are more likely to follow. So it's a sort of all these peer group interactions are quite important to study. And then the economic perspective. I really only hinted at this when discussing the Easterlin hypothesis, but there's much more literature on economic factors influencing fertility. Particularly intensive is the discussion about fertility being pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical. And so whether in good times people have more children or fewer children. And then finally, it's the psychological perspective. What goes on in the mind of people when we make reproductive decisions? And we need to give consideration of these ambivalent feelings. In the surveys, many women say, well, they don't really want a child, but they wouldn't also mind if it somehow happened. So how are you dealing with this in a quantitative model? Finally, it is really necessary to combine these different perspectives. And my last point here is really that this is not just a matter of a meta-scientific or philosophical considerations. Often when we study social phenomena, we say, well, you can have an economic perspective, you can have an anthropological perspective or a sociological. They all explain different sides of the phenomenon, and your conclusion just depends on what view you take, what approach you take. While this makes sense with qualitative phenomena, in terms of fertility, we do have one clearly measurable objective indicator, and that is the number of births in a given year. That's sort of a fact, an empirical fact. And all disciplinary perspectives need to be taken together. They do not only exist in their own rights, but they matter through their contribution in predicting the number of births. If you want to say how many births will be born in the year 2010, we need to combine the best of our demographic, economic, psychological, sociological, anthropological, and other knowledge together to predict this number. And for this reason, I think demography is the only discipline that explicitly and comprehensively addresses the number of births without being able to model all the determinants in detail. But for this reason, it can serve as an interface between the different disciplines for studying these interactions. I think I'm running out of time, and I'm not moving to the topic of the human capital, and want to conclude with this big challenge for science, which is of great relevance for the future of our populations, to better understand in an interdisciplinary context what kind of reproduction we will see over the coming decades. Thank you for your attention.